Hello, everyone. I am Amy Sandler, principal coach and podcast host at Radical Candor. Today, in addition to these headphones, I am wearing another hat, that of aspiring gardener. And by aspiring, I mean I've got a fake tree in my office that doesn't need any water. So I'm counting that as a win. We are really here today to talk about growth, not just of plants, but really of creativity, of courage, of connection. And I could not be more excited, more honored to welcome Debbie Millman to this conversation. Debbie has been named one of the most creative people in business by Fast Company. She is a designer, an author, illustrator, educator, a brand expert, also an executive fellow at Harvard Business School. And you might know her as host of the incredible Design Matters podcast, which has been 20 years running. Wow. Debbie's got her newest book, and let me pull this up here, Love Letter to a Garden. And it is exactly that. It is part memoir, part creative manifesto. It is chock full of wisdom about what it really means to tend to the things and the people that we love. So we're going to talk about gardening, creativity, failure, leadership. Maybe there will even be some gardening horror stories. And we are going to save time for a few questions at the end. This ends at the hour. So be sure to put them in the chat wherever you're watching. So welcome to everyone listening, and heartfelt welcome to Debbie Millman. Debbie, welcome.
Thank you, Amy. It's really lovely to be here. Thank you so much.
We're so excited to have you, and we are recording this today, April 17th, 2025. And wow, this has been such a week for you. You and your wife, Roxane Gay, you were featured in a stunning New York Times article that was showcasing your beautiful home, beautiful garden. This feels a little bit like, and that's not it. In addition to that, you had a huge event last night celebrating the launch of your new book, which we're going to talk about, but also 20 years of Design Matters with incredible guests, Krista Tippett, Esther Perel, Dr. Chelsea Clinton, and more. So I would love to just hear, how are you arriving in this moment after such a week?
Very gratefully, very, very gratefully, very humbly. I just can't believe that it's been the kind of week it's been. I mean, it's just surreal and magical and mystical. Those are the words that I can come up with to describe it. I'm still in the midst of it, and so I feel like I'm in a dream. It's been an incredible week, and I feel so grateful. You know, last night we had this big celebration at Symphony Space, and I had 20 of my all-time favorite guests participate in something we call 2020, which was asking all of those guests to pick their favorite parts of their interviews and share them with the audience. And then we did 2 interviews with Suleika Jouad and Chelsea Clinton, as you mentioned. And at the very end, you know, one question I've been asked a lot this week as I've been talking about the podcast, a lot of people have been asking, so what kept you doing it all these years? Why did you keep wanting to do more? And I said, well, I finally realized it last night, and I shared it with the audience, that I keep doing it as long as people are willing to listen. And so I just feel lucky that there are people that have connected with the show and are impacted by the interviews and find inspiration and growth in listening to it.
That is so beautiful. I love that. People keep showing up. People keep listening. For folks who haven't yet listened to Design Matters, how would you describe what you do in that podcast and the transformation that happens even in one interview?
Well, as we've been saying, I started the podcast quite by accident in 2005. I started it first as a live internet radio show, and I did it at a time when I was feeling really worried that my artistic creative spirit was being sort of diminished and maybe even dying. I had been working in my career, first as an aspiring writer and artist, and then moved into commercial art, and then moved into branding. And that's when I started to achieve a modicum of success. And that was really intoxicating because I had never been successful. I actually spent the first 13 years of my career out of college in what I call experiments and rejection and failure. And so to have any kind of success at that time, this was 1995, was really intoxicating. And I was very drunk on that. And I really committed myself to it for about 10 years, not quite, about 8 years before I started to feel this longing to get back to some of the things that weren't commercially viable, but still really, really important to me. And I got this cold call about doing this radio show. And I thought, that sounds fun and creative. Why not? And that's what what I thought they were doing. Voice America was offering me a job, but they were really offering me an opportunity to pay them to do the podcast. But that's how sort of desperate I was to actually do something creative and experimental and something I had no idea about. And so I signed on for 13 episodes. I ended up doing 100 episodes with Voice America, and then went more independent. And I started chairing a master's in branding program at the School of Visual Arts, and was lucky that they were able to build, the president allowed me to build a little studio in the space, studio within a studio, and started doing the show there. Um, but I would describe it now less a show about how designers design, which is what it started as, very much an inside baseball kind of a show, to now how the most creative people in the world design the arc of their lives. How do
Mm.
they become who they are? How do they, design is very much about intentional decision making in any endeavor, whether it be a room or a piece of clothing or a graphic design, product design. It's all about making very deliberate decisions. And so when I started interviewing more than designers, and then that grew. First it's designers and artists, now it's musicians, performers, scientists, um, any person that makes something from nothing. It's really about how they design the arc of their lives and the arc of their careers and the art of their practice in making something.
I love hearing about that shift, both in terms of the actual show itself, but also your shift because, people listening to Radical Candor, people who are, on their journey and whether as individual contributors into managers on a broader leadership journey, something that really leapt out at me was just that sense that as you were getting more successful, that you felt like you were almost losing some of that creative spark. And I know some of the things where people shift into management is the very thing that they love doing. And now they're, having to create a new skill set and maybe shift some of those very things that they loved about their work. So what thoughts do you have about that shift and what advice might you have?
Well, the interesting thing about working in a career where you're constantly getting better at something and getting promoted and so forth, that at some point you do get promoted to manage other people doing the very things that you love doing hands on. And management is a very different skill than any type of endeavor where you're making something. If you're making a design or a spreadsheet or anything that requires looking at something and transforming it into something else, is very different than managing the people that are doing the transforming. And management is really messy, and it requires so many different skills than making does, that you have to and I think a lot of businesses get this wrong. They think if you have an expertise at making this thing that you make and become really excellent at it, that somehow those skills will translate to managing others doing it, and they don't. They don't. It couldn't be more different. And so you really do have to learn tremendously different skills in order to really be able to lead people, which is what management is. It's not managing the minutia. It's actually managing much bigger, grander aspirations to get people to be able to feel inspired enough to do their best work with and for you.
You mentioned the word inspiration leapt out at me, and one of the things that I have found about your work and design and this new book, Love Letter to a Garden, is that you could have simply put, words on a page, but there is so much in the actual inspiration of the design, the whole experience of the book. And so what tips might you have for folks, whether they're, new managers or just anyone trying to communicate their ideas, that will land in a more effective way for folks?
Well, I think that who you are and what you represent is as important as your ideas. And so how you come to any endeavor is as important as the endeavor. I often say actually that it's not the mistakes we make, it's how we respond to the mistakes we make that gets us into trouble. Everybody makes mistakes, but how we respond to those mistakes and work through those mistakes is actually more important and more, there's more growth potential in that. And so I think that one's way of thinking about our work, our philosophy, what point of differentiation we feel contributes to the way we see the world and what we offer is as important, and in some ways, if not more important, because I think for creative people, ideas are kind of easy. We if being creative means you have lots of thoughts about how to make things, but how to create meaning from what we make, how to be able to communicate a point of view, a philosophy, a mission, even a particular style. That's much more strategic. I could ask any designer to redesign a water label. They'd be able to do that, in an hour. If I ask somebody to develop a new platform for a brand of water, a water delivery system, that would take a lot more strategic positioning and a lot more strategic thought. And so I think that anybody that's looking to manage someone needs to be able to give them both the room, the space. I'm not talking about the physical space, I'm talking about the intellectual and creative space and the power to do that kind of work.
You brought in power, you brought in mistakes, you brought in space, and so I wanna reflect back to you a wonderful episode that you did with Wharton's, Adam Grant, and you spent a lot of time talking about feedback. It's something we talk a lot about at Radical Candor, how to build more trusting relationships, being kind and clear, to start by asking for feedback, and you said in that interview, quote, I could get 500 wonderful evaluations and then one "you suck" evaluation, and that sort of demolishes me for a few hours, and that was a very strong relate for me. We were just sharing, I just did a TEDx talk this week on overthinking and that sort of perfectionism, and so first of all, you also said that that was actually much better than you had been before. So what has been your journey about both receiving feedback as well as giving it?
Well, in terms of giving it, I have had to manage people for a very long time. I became president of Sterling's design division about 3 years after I got there and went from being the chief rainmaker to also the chief manager. And I, by nature, am not only very demanding of myself, I'm very demanding of others. However, one of the best comments that I got about my management style was that I'm always demanding, but I'm always fair. And that was really important to me because I really do expect a lot of myself. And I always want to be better and I always want to be good. And I have a very very strong work ethic, and I always have. From the time I was little, I was always working hard and trying to do well. And so I expect other people to have that same work ethic. And I'm not talking about the amount of hours that somebody is working. I'm not talking about being the first one in and the last one to leave, although, who doesn't appreciate that? But I'm really talking about the way in which people work and the way in which they bring who they are to work. And so I feel a lot of camaraderie and a lot of gratitude for people that do want to work hard. And that to me is indicative of their commitment, not only to themselves, but to the work and to the outcome and to who they're serving with that work. Um, so I would say that I've grown I've been doing this for a really long time. I graduated college in 1983, became a real full-on manager and director by 1998. So 15 years into my career, I would say those first 15 when I was managing other people was haphazard at best. I didn't know what I was doing. I would get very frustrated and impatient very quickly. I look back on that with quite a bit of shame and regret because I didn't know what I was doing. When I started working at Sterling, the senior partner at Sterling was very committed to training. And so first I was doing training with people that we hired, firms that we hired to coach and train. And then when we were acquired by Omnicom, I got the benefit of very serious training through Omnicom University, which was a collaboration with Omnicom, Harvard, and Babson College. And that really helped me understand leading with generosity, leading with a sense of allowing people, helping people and allowing people and really coaching people to become the best that they could be. And, one of the best definitions of leadership that I learned through Harvard was the way to be able to inspire people to do things better than they ever thought that they could. And that's what I try to do, especially now with my students. I want them to become the best version of themselves that they can and to get over any fear, any trepidation, any sense of not being good enough to be the best version of themselves they can be. And that is my commitment to them. And that's why I expect them to work hard. I want them to work hard because I want them to work as hard on who they are as I am on helping them become who they are.
I love that so much, and it ties into something else that popped up in that episode with Adam Grant, where you talked about the relationship between competence and confidence, and you said how over the years, and I'm gonna quote and let me know where I've missed it. "I've come to realize that confidence is really just the successful repetition of any endeavor. You've done this enough times, you can statistically predict that you'll likely do it again. For those of us that can drive, we have car confidence. We
Right.
didn't start out with it, but we have it." So I
Right.
love this definition so much, this relationship, especially for those of us that are really hard on ourselves, sort of chicken and egg, like where do we start with competence and confidence?
Yeah. And I think that I have so many students that are waiting for confidence. I'll do that when I feel more confident. You're never going to feel more confident not doing it. You're only going to become more confident doing it. We are not a species like giraffes or elephants that come out able to walk. We have to learn how to walk. If we have to learn how to walk and learn how to talk and learn how to go to the bathroom, why do we think that management or presenting or any type of leadership skill is something that we would just acquire? We have to learn how to do it. And babies try to walk, and I have a little niece that's 2 years old, and I was watching her learn how to walk, and she was very, she'd hold on to things and then she'd fall and she'd cry, but then she'd get up again. Now she has walking confidence. Now she knows how to walk, and it took a while. Now she's learning how to talk. So I think that the expectation that we have that somehow magically, just because we want to do something well, that we won't do it until we think we'll do it well without ever having done it, is one of the biggest socialization mistakes or missteps that we have in our society.
This is such a great segue into, did we talk about failure and gardening? Let me see if I can get this in the camera there. Love letter to a garden. I probably failed on that, but I wouldn't know. Maybe if I keep doing it enough, I'll get the confidence, and the confidence. You know, so much about this book. It really is so beautiful, and there's a lot in there about, first of all, you're developing kind of a relationship with wonder around gardening. And I am wondering also about this relationship between wonder and failure. So we'll get to the failure, but can you tell me what drove you as this creative person to write a book about gardening? Like, where did that all start for you?
That wasn't even remotely on my bucket list, I'll
Yeah.
tell you. I have been gardening or trying to garden for most of my adult life. I first had an apartment in Manhattan with a little tiny deck outside the back room. And because I do love flowers and color, I immediately tried to create a container garden. There wasn't any grass, it was just a wooden deck. But that didn't stop me from trying to turn it into this sort of floral wonder. And I bought gardening pots and roses and plants. You know, roses to me were like the most beautiful plant at that time. I wanted them all around me and they smell so good and they're pretty. And so I got all these different varieties of roses and put them in the pots. Now, I didn't know roses need a lot of sun and they also need a lot of water. And so within weeks, they all died. And I was rather despondent. I did not have a lot of money. And so I felt like I'd wasted a lot of money and killed a lot of beautiful plants. Um, I was renting that apartment. And when it came time, when I had saved up enough money to be able to buy an apartment, one of the criteria that I had for where I was going to hopefully be able to buy a place was for it to have a little outdoor space so I could once again try to have an outdoor garden. And I gave up location for space. I bought a place in an apartment building at the time that was a bit of a crack block. It was a very sketchy block at the very, very northern tip of Chelsea, which was really like the most southern part of the Penn Station neighborhood. So it was not pretty. And there were a lot of drugs on the block, but I had a bigger place with a little bit of an outdoor space. And that had actual like soil. There was a tree. And so I could plant things. It also had two really big established rhododendron. Um, Somehow I managed to kill those too. So the idea of doing a book about gardening was not, again, in my wheelhouse at all. But during COVID, I spent most of COVID in Los Angeles, where my then fiance had a house. That's where she lived before we met. I lived in New York before we met, and we still have, for now, homes in both, but we are going to consolidate soon. And suddenly, I was living in a place that had sun, that did have an irrigation system. Roxanne had a backyard. And though it wasn't a garden, it was grass and boxwoods. I still had space where I could turn it into a garden. And when I did, because I had so much time on my hands, I started to document what I was doing with little visual stories that I was trying to make this space more beautiful. And the folks at the TED conference saw that I was doing that and asked me when TED went completely online that year if I would make some interstitials about my experiences trying to garden. And they asked me to do 3 different ones. And so I did love letter to traveling because I love traveling. I love the whole of sort of idea of exploring the world. and a love letter to storytelling, and a love letter to gardening. And that got me an opportunity to create a visual story when I went on an expedition to Antarctica. One of my traveling experiences. I wanted to go, I had this dream for many years of when I turned 60 to take a trip to Antarctica, not only to see Antarctica, but also to witness the total eclipse of the sun that was happening in Antarctica at that time. And so I went on this expedition, and Roxanne, my now wife, went with me, and I documented that just for the fun of it. And a Far magazine saw what I did and asked me then to write a visual story for them. Fast forward a couple of years later, I get an unsolicited email from a lovely editor at Timber Press, which is part of one of the big four, Hachette, asking me if I wanted to write a book on gardening. And I was like, is this a prank? And I said, if you want me to write a book about gardening for gardeners, you found the wrong person. I am still working at becoming like a decent gardener, let alone a gardener that is accomplished enough to write a book for other people. I said, but if you want me to write a quest book, like my quest to become a gardener, then I'm very happy to do that. And so she agreed, and that's what I did. It's this love letter to really trying to become better at something that you're really terrible at when you start.
First of all, thank you for sharing that story because as you were telling it, like, I really was visualizing, like, almost just these seeds being planted of, the TED conference reaching out and the interstitials and, "Oh, yeah, I can do a visual story about storytelling, and I can do a love letter about travel. Sure," and my own garden, and so there's something about, there's that Rilke quote about, live the questions now. Like, it's not like you were like, I am going to do a book on gardening, but these are the things that I can do. And these are the things I'm passionate about. And even just the phrase love letter, because when I picked up the book, like as the reader, I felt like it was a love letter to me as the reader. And I also felt, um, it was a love letter to your younger self. It was a love letter to the kid who found the dollar bill in the soil and saw the waterfall,
The
uh
favorite. I
oh my
conjure
gosh.
it.
Yeah, so I would love it, Debbie, would you be open to just reading a little bit from the book for folks
Sure,
wherever you wanna
absolutely.
go?
Um, okay, this is about, I guess, a third of the way through after numerous documented failures.
Yeah.
As I've gotten older, I've become less comfortable doing anything I'm not good at. I worry I'll look ridiculous and embarrass myself. As I came face to face with the fact that I was not a good gardener, I realized it was time to ask for help. Maybe, just maybe, I could learn something new. I began to read as much as I could about as much as I could and to learn from some smart people around me. And then I write, this is my cousin Eileen, and she's in her garden. She lives in Northern California and knows more about gardening than anyone I know. She took me under her wing and taught me about growing vegetables and attending to soil and how to compost. Together, we planted potatoes to get more potatoes, which was a bit of a revelation. Those are the potatoes. Do you want me to continue, or should we?
I wanna hear about what how did the revelation come about?
Well, potatoes, you don't plant potato seeds. You plant potatoes. You put a potato in the dirt, in the soil. And those eyes that pop out of a potato when maybe you've kept them too long on your shelf, those are what grow flowers to then turn into, in the roots, potatoes, more potatoes. So when you're digging for potatoes, there's I guess a leaf that comes out, a plant that comes out. Sorry, I was losing my language for a second. A plant that comes out, a green plant, but you pull that out and that's where the potatoes are. So you put a potato in the ground and then that is what makes new potatoes. It's magic.
It really is, and I feel like as you're saying that, I was like, "Oh, yeah, I think I knew that once a long, long time ago, and I didn't remember it," and there's something, in your book that I found really touching just about there's this refrain about time.
Mm,
There's this sort of visual about there was no time before time, and even what you shared earlier in our conversation of your niece and just the trying to walk and that sort of natural progression, and then there's this part of us that starts to shut down trying new things, and your students, which I can relate to, that sense of that sort of, "Let me get the confidence first, and then I'm not gonna try it," and then now we get older and maybe we are super successful and afraid to ask for help, like that piece that you shared. And so I'm curious, like, what was it in you that outcreated that sense of I should know how to garden, or I'm afraid to, I'm Debbie Millman. I should know how to make a garden, like what
no,
how did you outcreate that?
I never said that. I never said
I
that.
I would say that for you, so it's interesting how we put that onto other people.
Well, the thing is, I was more of, oh, I'm Debbie Millman. Of course, it's a failure. So, I one thing that I have talked about in the past, when a couple of years ago, when my book about my interviews came out, Why Design Matters, I was being interviewed by Brene Brown, and the book begins with my journey to starting the podcast and elaborates on what I mentioned before about feeling like I had been sort of losing my creative spirit, worrying that it might never come back. And it also went into a bit about how I'd had this sort of very late start to my career success. And she asked me, why did you even keep trying? Like, what kept you motivated to become more successful, to continue trying to make a difference with your work? And I really had to think about it because, you could always say, "Oh, I'm very resilient," or "I'm really persistent," or "I don't accept failure." But that I would still be despondent when I didn't get something that I wanted, and I was still really afraid to go after a lot of the things that I wanted, and I still am to this day. But something that applied to that continued effort more than resilience or persistence or whatever, and what overlaps with my quest for this garden over the decades was hope. And that when talking to Brene, I realized that I had one more molecule of hope than shame. The shame was still there, still very vibrantly kind of thrumming through me, but the hope was one molecule bigger. And I'm endlessly fascinated by astrophysics and how we all got here and the nature of time. And scientists talk about how maybe the universe was created because there was one molecule or atom or neutrino or quark more matter than antimatter. And that's how we ended up all here. And that's sort of how I feel about my life. I have one more molecule of hope that things will be better, that things could be created, that success will come, that love will come, than shame at what I worry I'm not worthy of.
I am what a gift to hear you say that in your words, and I will take with me that one more molecule of hope than shame. And, reflecting on this week that you've had that we started talking about that's been so magical and mystical, this sort of reflection back. For me, when I think about being in that spot of the planting the seeds, you don't know what's gonna happen. Is there a way to kind of gather up those hope molecules for sort of down the road? Or how are you trying to, like, absorb it and really celebrate that that even in those despondent moments, that little bit of hope peeked out? Like, what advice might you have for someone feeling more in the despondent, that where's my hope molecule?
I encourage people to wallow in that despondency because you will metabolize it. We metabolize all of our emotions. People says time heals everything. It's not so much time. Well, I mean, it is time in the grand scheme of things, but humans are metabolizing machines. We metabolize food, we metabolize energy, we metabolize love. And that's sort of why, when we're hungry, we might feel like we never want to eat another meal. And 5 hours later, we're picking through the refrigerator. I mean, we fall in love and that's all we can think about. And, we can't even conceive of what the world is like without this love. And then, 2 years later, like, stop breathing like that. And so we, but that doesn't mean we don't love, we just metabolize. And if we allow ourselves to these feelings, if we allow ourselves to feel the shame or feel the sorrow or feel the grief or feel the humiliation or feel the sadness is really under all of it, you will metabolize that too. The only thing we can't metabolize is regret, because regret, there's no closure. There's like, you can't metabolize a woulda, coulda, shoulda because you haven't done the woulda, coulda, shoulda. So the only real way to fail, the real way to fail is to not try at all. And so, I'm very much a believer in what Dan Gilbert calls synthesizing happiness, because, we can go after what we want, feel happy. We can go after what we want, not get it, feel sad, but then synthesize something else and maybe feel happy. But if you don't try at all, what do you can't synthesize regret. So for me, what I've learned, and what took me a very long time to learn, was it was okay to feel sad. I mean, to really feel sad, like to go into your bed, put the blankets over your head and cry for a few hours or a few days. But you will metabolize that and then get up and out of bed. Now, I'm not talking about like clinical depression, which I've also experienced. That is much more debilitating. It is months, and you do need professional help, which I've had. But for that sort of immediate, I didn't get that job, I didn't get that guest, I didn't get that opportunity, I was rejected from this school or that program or whatever, feel it. Like, don't pretend it didn't matter. So many people are afraid to admit that they feel bad about not getting something, or that they are like, I didn't want to go anyway. Like, you can say that you wanted to go and your heart is broken because you didn't get accepted. Feel bad and then metabolize it and pick yourself up and try something else.
I love that idea of metabolizing, synthesizing, really active, and using that as a creative spark. I'm a breathwork teacher, and my teacher, David Elliott, would often say, when there's an emotion like anger, mix some love into it, and that's passion. When there's some sadness, mix some love into it, and that's that creative expression. And so, in many ways, it is like that garden, and it is that fuel. And I'm curious, since you do work with a lot of young people and people, students, like, how open are they to this idea of metabolizing emotions and accepting it? What have you found resonates with them when you talk about that?
I think that because I'm so radically candid with my students about my journey, that I think they trust me a little bit more because they see evidence of my life moving in that direction. And I think that if somebody becomes more aware of your struggles, they're more likely to believe your advice and or your point of view, or just the way you live your life. And so I think that they're maybe buoyed by that, because I am not urging them to shoot their shot the minute they graduate. I'm suggesting to them that they take small steps up the mountain, because they can enjoy the journey. I think the joy is more in the making. I think that most creative people want success, but the joy is really from the making of the thing that other people appreciate, which then signifies success. But when they stop making things, that's when they feel the emptiness. So, one of the questions that I ask all my students and also ask in my column on print magazine, printmag.com, I ask a question in this sort of Proustian interview that I do. One of the questions that I'm really, really curious about is how long do the feelings of accomplishment last with you? How long does the pride of accomplishment last? And most people say, I think the most that anybody's ever said is like 2 weeks. And because we metabolize that too. We metabolize that. And if we metabolize that, we can metabolize anything. But what I really believe to be true is what they really keep seeking is the making, that's where the joy is. And that making could go on forever. We don't metabolize the process because we're in the process. And so allow it to take its time. And I do feel that underneath anger, most anger about everything, that underneath that is sadness and grief or feelings of misunderstanding. Somebody doesn't
Mhm.
understand this, and so we get angry, but it's really sadness and grief that we experience. Like, think about again, I've been spending a lot of time watching my 2-year-old niece. Wouldn't it be wonderful if every time we just felt angry, we just cried? That's what babies do. They cry. They want to be hugged. They want comfort. Now, of course, we can't all go around, as adults weeping into other people's arms, but, I think the world would be better if we could.
From your lips, to folks' ears, I think that just that acknowledgement of the sort of full range of human experience. I have, a friend who is an amazing poetry professor, Brad Aaron Modlin, and he shared a reflection with me from an artist who said that when it comes to our homes, like what we hang on our walls, what we wear, the art, the design, the fashion, that these are some of the few choices that we actually have some control over in our lives. And so I'm curious, like, because
Mhm.
so much of your book is kind of set against the backdrop of COVID and the grief and this sense of, a world that feels very much out of control. And so have you found that design, gardening, it almost can give us a sense of agency, like we're sort of tending to those things that we can have some certainty or choice or agency? How does
That's a
that land for
great
you?
question. That's a great question. I've been thinking a lot about control. Um, I recently lost somebody very, very important to me to cancer. And in her journey through this illness, I became really conscious of the fact that we can't control what's happening in our bodies. I mean, we can certainly, be careful about our diet and exercise and so forth, but we're not willing our hearts to beat. We're not controlling our digestive tract. We're not thinking about how often we blink. Our bodies are really operating very involuntarily, and we can't control most of it. Sure, we can control what we put into it, but we don't control what's actually happening in it, in it, which is terrifying. I know a lot of people that spend a lot of time tending to their diseases now. I'm 63, so of course, a lot of my peers are dealing with lots of things. I've dealt with a bunch of things. I couldn't control needing to get a hip replacement. I either could get one or not, but I couldn't control, what was happening. And then think about the world. We're living in a world where it's very hard to have any sense of control. And not only that, we don't have any. We have no control of what's outside. We have no control about what's inside. And yet we sort of want control. Humans desperately want to be able to predict what's going to happen tomorrow and understand that we're going to be safe. But maybe the only place we can control are our walls and our environments, our own environments. And I'd never thought of it that way. That's really quite an astonishing revelation because I've been really feeling like completely out of control with what's happening in the world, what's happening in many people that I love and the struggles they're having with disease or sickness. But yeah, we can control what we put on our
Yeah.
walls.
Yeah, well, I appreciate the reflection, the poignancy of it. Brad is an amazing poet, so I'm not surprised that the question landed. And speaking of amazing writers, before we close, there are some beautiful recipes in this book from your wife, Roxane Gay, like a MacGyver of tomato sauces, for example. Like
Strawberry
just the
tall
words,
cake,
like say that again.
the strawberry tall cake instead of a shortcake.
It's a very, very tall cake. How did that part of the book, because again, you didn't wanna write a gardening book, there it came. How did Roxanne's recipe writing come to be?
Well, while I was gardening all of these wonderful plants and growing vegetables and so forth, I didn't want anything to go to waste. And we had a lot of tomatoes, a lot of tomatoes. And so I would bring in the harvest. And so again, it was very much in COVID, and everybody was super concerned. So we were leaving our groceries in the garage for 2 days to make sure that they were disinfected. And we were wearing gloves in the supermarket and masks and whatnot. And so here I had all of these wonderful fresh vegetables and fruit. And I didn't spray anything. So, just eating it off the vine. And so she started making things with it. And I'm not a cook. I'm an eater, but not a cooker. And so, when it came time to conclude the book, I thought, what a wonderful way to share that bounty, like literally and figuratively, with people, because Roxanne's such a prolific cook, and such a prolific baker. That's her love language. That why not share some of the things that she created? And she went along for the ride.
It's so beautiful and delicious, and the reason I was reflecting on the kind of the beauty and the bounty of the recipes, and in many ways, when you were talking about metabolizing and synthesizing, you plant the seed, you don't know what will happen, something springs up, it becomes into a recipe, then we synthesize it, then it goes back, and there's just this ongoing cyclical nature to the whole process, and just acknowledging that the sort of juxtaposition of the grief and COVID that led to the sort of baking and, just holding that. I also feel, having done some workshops recently with folks that organize, grief workshops, just there is this kind of collective grief that I don't think has really been metabolized.
Yeah.
And so my intention is that, people literally putting their hands, in the soil, like feeling that, helping metabolize whatever those emotions, giving people permission to have that space and that emotion. This book really is a gift. So I'm so grateful for it. Before we close, what is one thing that you would like to encourage people listening to this just to plant after this conversation, after this book? What would be a next step you would encourage?
Well, if anybody's looking to plant something pretty easy that is very prolific, grows very quickly, unfortunately is an annual, so it won't come back next year, but is really gives you a lot of immediate gratification, our morning glory. Plant some morning glory around a fence or a window and watch it climb and watch it bloom every morning, morning glory. And you'll get a constant stream of joy from it. But also know that, like, we can't control what's in us or what's outside, you also can't control a garden, and that's another really important lesson. You kinda have to surrender to nature. So if it doesn't get quite enough sun or if you don't water it enough, it will not respond the way we want it to. So, and even if we do, we might not always respond the way we want it to, and so you do have to learn, a lot of patience in the process. But that's also part of the joy.
I think we'll close there with the patience, the joy, and the aspiration for morning glory, whatever the flower presents us with. Thank you so much for joining us, for really candidly sharing your experiences, the stories behind the book. It really is. I think you said it was 60 years and 6 months to really put the book together, and I am so grateful for that. We'll see if we have any. I don't see any questions right now,
But some
but
nice
we.
comments. I appreciate that.
Yeah, so we'll let you go on time, but thank you for inspiring us to grow what you love and see more of that in the world. Thank you so
Thank
much,
you,
Debbie.
Amy. Thank you. And thank you for doing this really beautiful work that you do.
Thank you. That means a lot. It's filling my cup to get these molecules of hope with you. So thank you. And for honoring the shame as well. Take
Thank
good
you. Take
care. Thanks all
care.
for joining us. We'll see you
Bye.
soon. Bye-bye.